Hi, I'm Ed Painter. Welcome to my home in Cohutta, Georgia. You're watching the Painter series on Delay and Block Productions.
Welcome to the Painter series by Delay in Block Productions. In our first feature-length presentation, we'll be spending time watching trains on Saluda Grade in the early 1990s through the lens of railfan and model railroader Ed Painter. Over a period of 7 years, beginning in early 1990 and ending in the winter of 1997, Painter spent a significant amount of time documenting Norfolk Southern trains on the steepest mainline railroad grade in the United States. This is the first time Painter has shared his footage with the world, and we're grateful he chose Delay in Block as his outlet. March 13th, 1990 marked Ed's first visit to Saluda. In the morning, he recorded the locomotives of the Hain Turn Local descending the grade at Melrose. The locomotives and caboose would be used to pull a cut of cars from the bottom of the grade at Melrose to West Yard in Asheville. In downtown Saluda, the trio of EMD SD40-2s was working hard in Notch 8 as the train approached the peak of the grade. West of Saluda, near Lake Summit, Ed recorded the train going over Spartanburg Highway as 377 made its way to Asheville. This would conclude Ed Painter's first visit to Saluda. He would return nearly 2 years later to document more trains tackling North America's steepest main line. On January 6, 1992, Painter filmed the famous Belmont coal train descending the grade at Melrose. The train originated in Appalachia, Virginia, and is destined for Duke Power's coal-fired Allen Steam Station at Belmont, North Carolina. The two EMD SD60s and the single SD50 were common power for the train at this time. A decade earlier, the older SD40-2 and SD45 series were common on the Belmont. At the time this footage was recorded, eastbound Belmont coal trains typically weighed in at 13,500 tons. In the middle of the train, an additional pair of SD60s were acting as the mid-train slaves, which were radio-controlled from the lead locomotive. The radio car in front of the locomotives contained the communications equipment used by Southern and later Norfolk Southern, allowing the master unit on the train's head end to communicate with and control the mid-train slaves. After catching the train at Melrose, Painter jumped ahead to Tryon, North Carolina, where he recorded the train at track speed. He would follow the train into South Carolina as it made its way to Spartanburg. On another evening, Painter recorded the Hayne turn tackling the grade, with the last SD50 ever built for Norfolk Southern leading the train. In 2022, Ed revisited the now abandoned Saluda Grade with his good friend and retired Norfolk Southern employee, John Marbury. The two go back decades and share the same love of railroad history. This is the same location where Ed stood over 30 years ago while filming The Hayne Turn and later Norfolk and Western 611. The two met up to walk part of the grade and reminisce about the good old days of trains on Saluda.
There was a story I heard. There was when the Carolina division was here?
Yeah, that's the original division was Carolina.
The
Division.
superintendent, a guy I knew named Larry Wetzel, and he was high railing with some people down here, and when he got down there to Melrose, he saw sand everywhere. Well, when those trains go in emergency, they go to sand.
Oh yeah.
And they were trying to, I think the trainmaster and all were trying to keep Larry's attention, so he didn't see it, but he saw it. He made him stop, and he got out, and he looked at him and says, "What happened here?" And they had to fess up. One had gone up on the track, safety track, and
Sanders just stayed wide open.
They kept it quiet. Even the superintendent didn't know about it. So a lot of people got in trouble for that, I think.
What year was that?
I don't remember. It was in the
Southern Railway days before Norfolk Southern.
Yeah.
So well over 40 years ago.
Yeah. But I remember hearing that he called him on that.
God, jeez. Well, there's a lot of things going on people don't know about.
I know.
We asked Ed what it was like to revisit Saluda after the grade had been abandoned for so many years.
It's extremely sad. I mean, all these trees growing up, rotten ties, signals missing, trees that are over top of the railroad, washed out sections under the railroad. It's extremely sad. And this location is right at 4.8% according to Norfolk Southern's track chart.
So back in the day, you got to see them maintain this railroad. How often did they take care of the grade here?
Well, they had people working almost continuously, making sure things didn't wash out, and just making sure things stayed in place, and the nature just didn't reclaim it. It just took almost a continuous effort to have folks out here maintaining things so that it stayed in good order, and it was really maintained well. This was a really good looking piece of railroad back then.
What was it like to hear a train at this part of the grade?
Well, they were working, locomotives were doing everything they could, wide open. You're at the steepest part of the grade.
Several weeks later, Ed returned to Saluda to document the Hayne Turn. This train operated between Spartanburg, South Carolina, and Asheville, North Carolina. At the time, it was the only guaranteed train on Saluda, as it operated Mondays through Fridays and spent most of its time doubling or tripling the hill at Melrose. From the west side of Sand Cut, Ed recorded the 3 EMD SD40 series locomotives descending the grade for Melrose. Having just dropped off their initial cut at the west end of Saluda, the trio of SDs was returning to Melrose to grab another cut of cars. In 2021, the signal at this location was removed, relocated, and restored for public display at the Bulls Gap Railroad Museum in Tennessee. Several years ago, the curve the locomotives are traveling over suffered a serious washout. Spanning 2.7 miles from the bottom of the grade at Melrose to the crest at Pace's Crossing in downtown Saluda, the Mountain of Challenge averages an estimated gradient of 4.7%, peaking at 5.1%, while gaining an elevation of 606 feet. Without a doubt, no other mainline railroad in North America was as challenging to operate as Saluda Grade. Saluda hasn't seen a freight train in over 20 years. What was once a bustling main line between Asheville, North Carolina, and Spartanburg, South Carolina, is now a lonely, idle stretch of abandoned railroad. During Ed's 2022 visit to the grade, we asked him what it was like to watch trains working at Melrose.
The road foreman getting off the head end, stopping the train and releasing the retainers that were set on the front group of cars in Saluda. And just in general, not just coming down, but coming back and cutting the train and, taking cuts up, and coming back to get the next cut. A lot of action down here. Really a very, very, very cool place back in the day. It'll never be back in service again, but golly Nat, considering what this used to be, it's just sad.
Now, Ed, you were telling me at your house about an 11-car limit on carrying chips up the mountain. Tell me a little bit about that.
Well, they were limited to 11 chip cars, and that had to do with a combination of weight and curvatures and this and that, and not so much the ability of the locomotives to handle that up the grade or even more, but concern over drawbars and knuckles and things like that getting broken, per what I remember.
And watching some of your videos, we noticed that they didn't quite go into notch 8 right away. They kind of eased into it.
Yeah, they sort of got it going, and once they sort of bit into the steeper part of the grade, then they took it all the way up. So yes, interesting how they didn't just take off like a bat out of hell. They ease it up into speed and then notched it up to put full power to everything to get it up to grade.
What would you say about the professionalism of these train crews and their handling skills?
Well, they didn't screw around. They got things done. They were efficient. They were proficient, and they were generally pretty nice folks to chit chat with or watch and work. And they were safe and good employees. Did a good job.
At Melrose, the engineer and conductor had a short conversation with the brakeman and the road foreman of engines before departing for downtown Saluda. The wood chip cars in this section of the train are bound for the Champion International Paper Plant in Canton, North Carolina. Wood chips were the #1 commodity transported up the grade for many years, and were also the primary economic reason the grade remained open as long as it did. The 3 high-hood SD40 series locomotives are on home rails. All 3 were built for the Southern Railway in the 1970s. Number 3173 was actually a straight SD40 and was built in April of 1971. The SD40 locomotive and the SD45 shared the same frame, whereas the SD40-2 shared the longer frame of the SD45-2, which is why the SD40-2s had such long front walkways, commonly nicknamed porches, compared to the shorter walkways of the SD40s. According to Painter, 3 SD40 series locomotives were the favored power for these trains. Without microprocessor controls, these locomotives allowed the engineer to be in total control of his train. A skilled, experienced engineer could do a far better job handling trains up and down the grade than any computer. On the east side of Sand Cut, Painter recorded the trio in Notch 8 as they approached one of the steepest sections of the grade. Bringing up the rear end of the Hayne turn was a large auto parts boxcar. For many years, this type of boxcar could almost always be found on the rear of the train. Note the EOT device placed on the rear coupler instead of a caboose. Although most road trains still used cabooses or cabs, as the Southern Railway called them, locals were less likely to have them during this time period. At the west end of Saluda, crews reassembled their trains before departing for Asheville. The final cut at Melrose would now be right behind the locomotives towards the front of the train. During his many visits to Saluda, Ed got to know many of the train crews. On this mild March afternoon, engineer Frank Ramsey and conductor Frank Coxey were in charge of the train. The two seasoned railroaders preferred the older EMDs, like these veteran SD40s, to the newer power of the day. At the Asheville suburb of Buena Vista, Southern Railway installed these signs which read, "Have a safe trip on the safest Carolina Division territory, the ANS." They stood for many years as a reminder of the outstanding safety record of the train crews operating over the W line. One week later, on March 6th, Painter returned to the W line to chase the Hain turn as it was running between Spartanburg and Asheville. At Melrose, Painter set up near runaway track number 2 to record the train arriving at the bottom of the grade. With soaked wood chips, these loaded cars were heavier than normal. Unlike the weather during his previous visit, the rain meant train crews would have to use more caution while handling the cuts up the grade. Wet rail conditions meant the possibility of wheel slippage was very real. The next day, Ed found the Hayne turn as it was approaching Spartanburg, South Carolina. Sigsbee is just north of Southern Shops. Later in the day, Painter returned to Melrose, where he found the Hayne turn preparing to ascend North America's steepest mainline grade. The lead locomotive, number 3258, was built in January of 1978 for the Southern Railway and was set up to run long hood forward. The locomotive remains on Norfolk Southern's roster 30 years later, but was rebuilt with an Admiral cab in 2014. Diesel locomotives greatly improved safety and enhanced operations both up and down the grade. Thanks to dynamic braking technology, Southern Railway and later Norfolk Southern would be able to handle much longer and heavier trains over Saluda. Now with another cut in tow, the trio of SD40 series locomotives would take on Saluda once more. West of Saluda, near Lake Summit, Ed caught the train crossing over Spartanburg Highway. Zirconia is home to a sweeping S-curve. It's also where the present-day abandoned section of the W line begins. Traffic over Saluda Grade was suspended in 2001, and in April of 2003, Norfolk Southern severed the W line from the rest of its system by placing mounds of dirt over the tracks and disconnecting the rails at mileposts 26 and 45. On March 20th, Ed returned to the W line to chase the Hain turn once again. On this date, he encountered more rainy weather, but didn't let it deter him from capturing some great footage. The whistle posts at Grambling, South Carolina, are a clear indicator that this line is of Southern Railway heritage. Two days later, Painter found himself on Saluda at a section of the grade measured at 4.8%. Looking towards Sand Cut, this spot provided one of the best locations to film trains climbing the grade. After the train had ascended the hill, Ed moved to the opposite side of Sand Cut to record the locomotives returning to Melrose. Jumping back to the upgrade side of Sand Cut, Painter set up to record the classic trio of EMDs working hard with another cut of cars. With their train now assembled, Ed would chase 377 all the way to Asheville. Here, at Macedonia Road west of Saluda, he caught the train working hard as it made its way towards Hendersonville. Breaking away from train 377, Painter caught local P45 at Skyland, North Carolina. Ed caught up with the train at Biltmore Interlocking in Asheville. The depot to the right was a station stop for the Southern Railway's Carolina Special. The Special was a passenger train that was operated by the Southern between Cincinnati, Ohio, and the Carolinas. It operated from 1911 to 1968 and was the last regularly scheduled passenger train to run over Saluda Grade. P45 served industries along the Tuxedo Branch between Brevard and Hendersonville, North Carolina. Later in the afternoon, Ed caught local train P33 crossing the French Broad River at Asheville. The train was headed for the paper mill at Canton with wood chip cars that were delivered the previous day by 377. Today, this job is operated by Watco's Blue Ridge Southern Railroad, which has a long-term lease agreement with Norfolk Southern. The train now operates as T33. The last train Ed recorded in Asheville on this day was westbound hopper train 723. The 6-unit consist had a lot of variety, with both EMD and GE locomotives. We hope you enjoyed our first installment of the Painter series and look forward to bringing you more classic railroad videos from Ed's extensive collection. Thank you for watching Delay in Block Productions. Until next time, happy railroading.